And welcome everybody once more. The webinar today is called Community-Led Strategies to Combat Resident Displacement webinar. The sponsor for today's webinar is Wells Fargo, who has been sponsoring all of our education this year. Thank you to Wells Fargo for their support. Also want to thank Jonathan and Mary, who are our presenters today, who will be sharing their vast knowledge with you. I will let them introduce themselves, and I will go ahead and switch over. Jonathan, Mary, it's all you.
Thanks, Philip. Don't know about vast knowledge, but you guys can be the judge of that. But yeah, happy to be here. And this is a little interesting because I don't think we've done a webinar like this before. It's weird not to see everybody's faces, but I assume, Philip, you can let us know if we're messing up. But yeah, I'm Jonathan Capelli, the founder of Capelli Consulting, which is a public policy organization that kind of focuses on affordable housing. Been around since 2015. Many of you, especially folks in the city and others I see that are in attendance here, I know through my work as the director of the Neighborhood Development Collaborative, which is a nonprofit coalition of housing nonprofits. But this work was done through Capelli Consulting as a consultant project for the Colorado Health Foundation, and we'll get a little more into that aspect of the project later. But go ahead, Mary, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Mary Coddington. I'm an associate with Capelli Consulting. I've been working with Jonathan since 2018, I believe. And yeah, working on finishing my Master's of Urban and Regional Planning at UC Denver. I'll go ahead and get started.
Thanks. Okay, let's see. All right, so yeah, thanks, Mary, for putting that up. So let's go to the table of contents, please. So essentially, we're going to go over the project and define gentrification, define displacement in Denver, and then get into some of the, in particular in Westwood, and then talk a little bit about how we, one second, let me close my door. I have some active roommates. Let's see. Get into sort of the work that we've been doing on this project with Lydia, and then kind of just sort of describe the rest of the project from there. We're going to kind of start with this overview of gentrification as sort of a level set for everyone. Next slide, please. So we just introduced ourselves earlier. Dr. Lydia Prado couldn't join us today, but she's the other partner on this. Essentially, the Health Foundation partnered with nonprofits across the state to essentially pair community groups with housing consultants, policy consultants that could sort of help them move from whatever stage of being interested in intervening in the housing sphere was to actual programs. And so there's programs in Sterling and out further west. And then the project in Denver is focused on Westwood. And so the Health Foundation picked Lifespan Local, and Dr. Lydia Prado is the director of that organization, and then paired Capelli Consulting with them for this project. Lifespan Local is a Southwest Denver-based org, and they work on a variety of things, not just housing, essentially through reaching out and working with community members to figure out what their needs are, and then sort of devising projects and programs based on that. And it was through a survey, that a number of surveys they had done, that they identified, with residents, they identified housing as a really important thing that everyone was really concerned about, and that's how they sort of got into the housing realm. I'm sure Health Foundation needs no introduction, but it's up there if you need to read it. Next slide, please. So, when we first, proposed this, and with the Health Foundation, this presentation to Housing Colorado, things were very different, obviously. So COVID-19 definitely threw a big curveball to everyone, and we were no exception. So whereas initially the project really was to work with with Lifespan Local and Dr. Lydia, and then devise these programs, and then move to an implementation phase, we definitely got held up significantly as far as implementation goes. And everything really pivoted to addressing the imminent and immediate needs of COVID-19. So for those who haven't been tracking the Census Bureau Pulse Survey data that has been coming out, right now we have about 10% of Colorado households are delinquent, 10.39% on their rent. And for homeowners, it's 6% are delinquent on their mortgage payments. So that's actually pretty similar to some of the data that the Eviction Defense Project laid out in a variety of news articles that many of you probably saw over the last few months. If it looks smaller, it's because in those articles they were using individuals instead of households. So if you do the math, it's very similar numbers. We divide by 2.3. So that are the conditions. And as a result, Lifespan Local has really shifted to focusing on direct rental assistance and housing, assistance, pairing people up, households in need with programs where they exist. And then really honing in on food access disparities and hunger, which is a big issue in Westwood as well. So there are other tables that have continued to do anti-displacement work. I think Renee Martinez-Stone is probably on the call. Oh, go ahead.
Jonathan, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a request that it's a little bit hard to hear. If you wouldn't mind speaking up a little bit.
Okay. Is this better?
Thank you. That's
okay.
Great.
All right. Let's see. So I was just saying that Lifespan Local has pivoted to focusing on some of these, immediate needs due to COVID, including food access disparities and things like that. And that there's still other groups that are working directly on anti-displacement work, and groups like Renee Martinez-Stone's group, WDRC, and a variety of city tables. We'll just kind of show you what we have that is, the goal would be to feed into some of these existing initiatives, and then of course turn into programs once we get past this, whenever that is. Okay. So defining gentrification and involuntary displacement. I know there's a variety of levels of expertise on this webinar when it comes to gentrification, but just like I was saying, to sort of level set, the way we think about gentrification is a process wherein a community's socioeconomic profile increases over time due to an influx of higher earners, and that usually comes with demographic and racial changes. It's a descriptive term. Neighborhoods have been changing for a long time. So sometimes people hear gentrification and there's debate on how good or bad that is, right? So when we're talking about gentrification in a negative sense, it's because we're focusing on involuntary displacement, the process wherein low-income minority populations are forced out of historically affordable communities due to rising housing costs. Gentrification is an indicator often of involuntary displacement. Next slide, please. So yeah, I feel like most times that I've spoken about gentrification, there's usually a comment that says it's something like, it's not new, part of a city's natural evolution, makes the neighborhood nice, cleans it up, makes everything safe. Who doesn't like yoga and lattes? And why is this all different now? So the reason why it's different is because the country is, facing a pretty widespread level of displacement at most urban centers or major urban centers, especially along the coast, with a few hotspots in the middle of the country like Colorado. And a lot of it has to do with the fallout of the Great Recession, with a lot of low to moderate income households who lost equity in their homes during that crisis. And then you had a huge influx of investors who then bought up a lot of those properties, right? And flip them and turn them into rentals and cause a lot of the erosion of the members of low-income neighborhoods and minority households across the country in urban areas. And we saw it a lot in Denver as well. We'll show a map on how that pattern kind of looks in a little bit. Hopefully we don't need to make the case for why it's important to have a diverse, economically and racially diverse, population in a city, but that is essentially what is at risk here if you don't do something about it. Next slide, please. So another way of looking at this is there are disparate outcomes and impacts of gentrification in any city, in Denver as well. A quick sort of walk down history lane would be starting with the Homestead Act way back in the day in the 1860s. There was a huge award of land to any homesteaders who could, go west and find a plot. And about 20% of today's families who are not people of color descended from folks who got access to home ownership and through that program, through that really old policy. Then you have the GI Bill, right, in the 40s, which really led to the post-World War II white middle class, but also discriminated heavily against Black servicemen and people of color. So it made it, as I said, a white middle class program in a sense. Then you get redlining, which I'll hopefully not explain as well, but essentially barred Black households from getting mortgages, sometimes within their neighborhoods and outside of neighborhoods as well, and outside of Black neighborhoods and in white communities, preventing integration. And then finally you get the Great Recession, where Latino, and African-American borrowers were 30% more likely to get subprime loans. 8% of then recent, so it had been like 3 years or so, recent homeowners at the time that were Black or Latino lost their homes, compared to 4.5%. And then 56% of all the foreclosures happened to Black and brown households. And you can really see that if you look at foreclosure patterns within the city of Denver, where it's west and north and historically Latino and historically Black neighborhoods where the highest concentration of these foreclosures were, which created the gap for the gentrification that we are seeing today. Other things include, oh, never mind, that's right, go ahead. Thanks, Mary. So those different and discriminatory origins lead to disparate racial outcomes. So what does it look like today? These are, this is countrywide data, but it's similar at the state level. Median income of Black and Latino or Latinx households are 62% and 64% of that of white incomes. But you go a little further down and you see that home ownership rates are, for white people, are twice that of Black people and 1.5 times that of Latino people. And then when you get down to wealth, which is often predicated historically on home ownership, you see this really massive disparity. It's almost like there's a waterfall of disparities, right, that results in this huge wealth gap of $1,600 average wealth for a Black family, $21,000 for Latinx family compared to $162,000. So why do we need to be concerned about gentrification in the city? Well, because of all of these disparate impacts and acts of disenfranchisement, you have disproportionately Black and brown families being disproportionately low income. They tend to be renters, concentrated in low income neighborhoods, and then those neighborhoods are vulnerable to displacement. So it's kind of painting that sort of picture. This is why we should be dogged in our both policy and programmatic approaches to addressing this. Okay, hopefully, Philip, am I still getting quiet? Sorry, just want to check.
I'm still good. I can hear everything.
Okay.
So I think we're still good. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Let's see. So displacement in Denver in particular. So this is a map that has been revised a couple of times, I think, by the city over the years that measures vulnerability to displacement in the city. So the indicators are basically predicated on median household income being lower than Denver's, the percentage of of renter-occupied units being lower than Denver, and the percentage of population with less than a college degree being higher than Denver's. And so there's Westwood, neighborhood in the west, sort of southwest side of Denver, and it's, it fits that very well. This is something, by the way, if you look at the whole city, that is often referred to as the inverted L, sort of an L going up the west side and over the north side, where you tend to see both where historically Black and brown neighborhoods were and which ones are currently being gentrified and having huge spats of displacement. And I think Renee is on the call, but so feel free to comment if I slaughter this data, because I know this is your data, Renee, but based on some data that was created by that group, WDRC, cross-referenced with addresses of folks who are in West Denver, they noticed that the majority of families who were leaving DPS, who took their kids out of local schools and moved away, well, their homes are now owned by LLCs, which really illustrates this pattern of how, what kind of turnover is happening, what kind of entities are acquiring these homes. And so that was a study for West Denver, and Westwood was included in that. Next slide, please. A little more about the context of Westwood. 78.9% Latinx compared to 30% in the rest of Denver. Higher percentage of the population is young, under 18. That's twice as high as Denver's rate. Fairly low percentage of owner-occupied homes compared to the city, and then also let's see, and then high, percentage of households that are people of color in general. And then in particular, relevant to this is, or relevant to displacement, is that it's a significantly higher percentage of folks in Westwood that are paying more than 30% of their income on housing, meaning, of course, that they're even more vulnerable to increases in rent or housing costs in general. Next slide, please, Mary. Occupations, you can read on the left there, a lot in the construction industry, accommodation, food services, professional management, administrative, and waste management are sort of the top three categories. The household income is much lower than Denver's, and again, illustrating that the percentage of rent or your housing cost burden levels, right? The median, you can see that there's that disparity between Westwood's median income and then the median income of the city, and then Westwood's median gross rent and the gross rent of the city. So it's a lot closer, right? Meaning that there's a kind of a larger gap between what people are earning and what and how much they're having to pay for rent. Next slide, please.
All right.
Yep, go ahead, Mary.
So I'll take it from here. So now that you guys have a little bit of background on the context of the Housing Readiness Initiative pilot program and the Westwood Context, a little bit more about how we approached this particular program. We used the factors that we talked about earlier, as well as some additional factors, to do some mapping to identify households that might be at a particular vulnerability for displacement, so that direct services could be offered to those residents that pertain to the needs that they might have. So for this analysis, some of the defined indicators that we looked at were the date of the last sale and the age of the property, and both of those were considered in the context of renter-occupied homes as well as owner-occupied homes. And then we looked at the foreclosure status. We also looked at the most recent sale price of the property, and properties that were owned by entities that had several different properties in their portfolio. And for those last two, for the sale price and for properties owned by entities with multiple properties, there needs to be a word for that. We looked at that in the context of Westwood as well as in the context of the larger city. So what some of that looked like, one of the maps that we put together was for the low sales price. And these were properties that were sold for $50,000 or more below the median sales price. And this map is showing for Westwood. We also ran this analysis, like I said, for properties that were sold that much below the median for Denver. And the reason why this indicator is important is that it could indicate homes that are in poor condition and need rehab or repair, and that maybe if these owners had access to that kind of repair, they wouldn't have had to sell them. These properties may have been subject to purchases from organizations like We Buy Ugly Homes that come in and offer really low purchase prices. Or it could indicate that there were just mounting financial pressures for the owners. And you can see in the bottom, in the legend there next to the year, it shows how many properties in that year were sold for that amount below the median in that year. And you can see that there was a jump between 2014 and 2015 from 49 properties to 78 properties. And then again, from 2016 to 2017, there was another really big jump. Another piece that we looked at was the age of the properties. And again, this was separated into rental properties and owner-occupied properties. And this is another indicator that the properties, if they're very old, may be in need of rehab or repair. Depending on the tenure type, the response might be different, the intervention might be different. If it was an owner-occupied home, again, maybe you would step in and try to connect somebody with resources for that repair. Landlords could respond to needed repairs by raising the rent to cover the repair costs to levels that are unaffordable for the tenants that are currently occupying those units. Potentially, landlords might not address the needed repairs, and then you have unsafe living conditions, or they could just sell the property, which would again likely result in the displacement of the tenants. And so it's good to see where these trends are and create an approach based off of that. Another area that we looked at were open foreclosures. So we looked at about a 5 month period, and there were 12 properties with open foreclosures. And 2 of those properties were actually single family rentals. So overall, we had about 9 distinct vulnerability indicators. And then we took those indicators and combined them in 3 different ways and came up with these combined vulnerability maps. This particular example shows properties that are owned by entities with 3 or more properties in their portfolio in Denver that also sold for significantly less than the Westwood median for the year sold. And so looking at these, knowing that the people who live here are subject to multiple indicators of vulnerability, they probably have a higher likelihood of needing intervention to avoid displacement. And then the final mapping analysis that we did is a local hotspot analysis. And by looking at it this way, we can see properties that have a high value relative to the properties immediately around them. So those are going to be the dark red properties on the map. And that's where you get clusters of those. You start to get where homes are priced by comparable properties around them. And when the overall price is going up, you can see a neighborhood that's sort of starting to turn over and become more expensive. And then alternately, where the dark blue parcels are on the map, those reflect properties that have a low value in the midst of a high value block. And that could be an indicator that those residents could soon be priced out of the neighborhood. So it's really great to see all of that laid out in maps. You're able to see where things are clustering and where trends are, but in order to make that information actionable, you really have to be able to connect the vulnerability factors with specific properties. So we also compiled the information in data tables that were separated by all of the topics you see on the left of the screen there, and they're searchable, allowing people to, if they're wanting to connect a person with housing like rehab or repair, they maybe would search for the year the property was built and filter it that way in order to target their response. So some of the key findings, 52% of properties sold for at least $50,000 or more below the Denver median. To put that in perspective, in 2012, I think the median home price in Westwood was about $155,000. So that's, a third of the cost of the home. So it's considerable. we see that 26% of the homes sold for that much below the Westwood median, which is considerably lower than the cities, and 21% of properties were owned by entities with multiple properties in Denver. That indicator could show if it's an institutional landlord that they're potentially, not taking care of their properties, especially if they're from out of town. We also separated out properties that were owned by nonprofits like Denver Housing Authority from that piece of the analysis. Overall, 91% of the homes had at least one indicator, and 43% of homes had two or more indicators attached to them. In terms of responding to the data, I will go ahead and turn it back over to Jonathan.
Thanks a lot, Mary. In case you're sort of wondering why we took that approach that Mary just took you through, sort of the logic here was that it's one thing to create a program and sort of like a build it and they will come model to addressing displacement and hoping that folks will reach out if they have needs, et cetera. But we know that the market operates much differently, and that there's dedicated and specific outreach to households that often fit some of the indicators we were looking at to do the to buy them cash now sort of schemes, et cetera, and kind of just predatory investment strategies in general. And so we felt like that it made the most sense to not just do a build and they will come, but use the same sort of indicators that the market looks at and then reach out to those households proactively with specific potential interventions or resources in advance of displacement. This is not we made it as scientific as we could, but not every household that fits all those indicators is necessarily about to leave or is in danger of displacement. But the best we can do is use that filter to then sort of have more targeted outreach. So that was the point of that. In terms of framing a response, Lydia and Mary and I thought about it in sort of this way. So underlying cause of displacement is what do we do with this data, right? So the underlying cause of displacement is a lack of resources to mitigate the rising cost of land values and property taxes. And then that's reflected in financial instability of homeowners, and then corresponding predatory property investors, low profit margins for landlords, which incentivizes them to raise rents, right, as their taxes go up. And then results in this diaspora of minority and low-income households. On the other side, you have high demand for housing, leading to these rising costs, right? Insufficient supply at all levels. I know there's a lot of developers on here, so you guys can appreciate the land scarcity and other issues that constrain development in the state and the region. And then insufficient access to stable housing for low-income households. So, within that shrinking supply, even if you had a larger supply, it's still difficult to get low-income households into home ownership. Commercial pressures, and then homes around bordering those commercial developments, sometimes increasing in property values, et cetera. And then lastly, a lack of coordination between public entities who sort of invest in large scale infrastructure improvements and other developments. There's a lack of an effort to mitigate what sort of effects that's going to have on the market, and especially in displacement vulnerable communities, where those sort of things will, though not bad, might inadvertently result in displacement. So we think about it that way. Next slide, please. What sort of interventions could we create? So upstream on that would be direct tax abatement to landlords and homeowners. That's not quite as far upstream, I suppose, that you could argue that's midstream, because other things result in the taxes going up in the first place, right? But bear with me. So tax abatement programs, and then mitigate the displacement related effects of those investments through a variety of programs or policies, mitigate the projected displacement effects of those investments through, on the private side, through proactive cost offsetting policies, such as tax mitigation, I'll talk about a few of those in a second. And then that's separate from the tax abatement, but I'll explain in a second. And then developer concessions, right, to offset the ill effects of those investments in advance, insofar as that will actually have a huge effect on gentrification. So downstream approaches would be fund efforts to preserve affordability of large rental properties when they are for sale. Provide housing cost vouchers to help renters and owners afford rising or unexpected costs. Essentially, if you're going to deal, if there's not a overarching top-down strategy, then how do you mitigate the effects of the gentrification pressures? That's kind of what this bullet list is. Increase the ability for low-income residents to become homeowners, provide housing education to thwart predatory investors, create legal protections to prevent wrongful evictions. I think most of you guys probably know that Colorado has pretty poor renter rights protections compared to many other states or most other states. And then fund rehab so that owners and landlords who maybe didn't want to leave but feel like they have to because they can't afford repairs, don't. The green part of this is essentially where on the slides is where Lydia and Lifespan Local sort of focus kind of ended up on is working to taking a home ownership perspective to both protect current homeowners and then increase the ability for low-income residents to become homeowners. So next slide, please. So programs versus policy. For the record, so I often have a policy hat on. I just want to say that programs are really important, but anti-displacement policy is kind of the first step you need to take to have a systemic, system-wide, cascading positive effect on limiting displacement. No amount of one-off programs in any place throughout the city is going to be able to thwart the kind of gentrification that we're seeing, right? If you look at just in Denver, I think it's about 9.9% of the homes in the city are subsidized affordable through one way or another. So even on something that is like a pretty large market, I mean, Housing Colorado, there's all these organizations that are doing development all the time, right? It's still just 1/10 of the total residential market, right? With all of that. So even if you were to create an anti-gentrification initiative that was program-based, that was as robust as the development side of affordable housing that exists, there's no way you would be able to really solve gentrification at a systemic level. So you have to do these things. Denver's been talking about preference policies for a little bit. There are some tax mitigation programs and abatement programs, but getting those out wider. Tax increment financing revenue set aside is something that's used in, I believe it's Portland, where revenue from TIF programs are set aside and put into accounts for creating more affordable housing and anti-gentrification programs. Homestead preservation reinvestment zones, something in Austin. Next bit, please, Mary. So, for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on the program side because that's the angle that we're looking at. But I just think we'd be remiss if we acted like this was the solution. But if you have any questions about some of these policy interventions on the left side of the slide, feel free to reach out. Okay, next. So existing programs and preservation strategies, you have repair rehab programs like we were mentioning with Dura and Habitat for Humanity and a couple other organizations as well. You have income stream strategies, Sunshine Home Shares, Open Up, WDRC. These organizations work to basically develop an additional revenue stream for homeowners so that they don't feel those displacement pressures as acutely, and provides a financially sustainable way of staying in the community. Next, please. Then you have land trusts. Habitat for Humanity recently joined with the Colorado Community Land Trust. So that's why they're on that side. Elevation Community Land Trust, the Global Swansea Land Trust. for those who aren't familiar, land trust is when essentially residents own their homes, but they, oh, that's a little typo there. The residents aren't really leasing the land. Rather, the land trust owns the land and leases that land to the resident. The resident owns their homes on top. Residents build equity through the ownership of the home and that appreciation over time, but long-term affordability is preserved because the ownership of the land being held by the land trust allows them to essentially have agreements about at what increment the value can increase over time and ensure that the next generation of homeowners will be able to afford it, right? And that's something that's happening pretty actively. Denver's committed $5.5 million in 2019 to create 79 homes with this model. I think it was just a groundbreaking yesterday or day before yesterday in GES with Brothers Redevelopment. And I think it was the Global Area Swansea CLT group there. And then there's cost assistance programs run by the organizations listed there, both Denver Human Services, but also Northeast Denver Housing, Brothers, Del Norte, groups that that do direct cost assistance. Okay, next. So here are some things that we've been exploring in addition to that, in addition to sort of the strategies that already exist that were mentioned earlier, and I'll let Mary take it away.
Yeah, so the strategies that Jonathan just went through, those programs are really about stabilizing people in the homes that they're already in. One of the things that we did in an environmental scan for as well were programs to get people into home ownership that might otherwise be excluded. So we looked for different programs across the country that sort of fit that bill. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Homewise Model, and this is out of New Mexico. They operate in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. And it's an organization that incorporates a lot of different aspects of home ownership. They do home buyer education. They create and service mortgages on the properties and do pretty much, they're vertically integrated and they do a lot of stuff in-house. The way that they're able to keep costs down for residents is that they put 2 mortgages on a property, and the second mortgage is held by Homewise. It's the riskier of the 2. And so they're able to have a really low down payment, only 2%, and no private mortgage insurance. So it saves a lot of costs for the buyer. They had 644 new owners through the program in 2019. And the model has a very low delinquency rate and very few foreclosures that come through this process. The challenges with the program is it does take a lot of time to prepare a resident for ownership, and the organization has a really large capacity to provide so many services in-house. So it's something that really would have to be built up. The next program is the CHN Lease Purchase Model. This is out of Cleveland, Ohio. And they use LIHTC in a really interesting way. Instead of using the 9% LIHTC to finance multifamily buildings, they use the 9% to finance sort of scattered site single family rentals. And then once the initial 15-year affordability requirement expires, they sell the property to the person that was renting the unit. So this is a really great way to prove and move people through the housing continuum from rental to ownership. They have about 90 people who take title every year. They have a 99% success rate, and part of that is attributable to the really intensive homebuyer education process that they have leading up to the transfer of title. They spend about 5 years with a resident before the resident takes title, and that's something that's afforded to them by having that 15-year affordability requirement that goes along with the LIHTC. It's also accessible to residents that are excluded by underwriting standards from Fannie and Freddie. The downside of this is it's a really long-term strategy. You know, if you're using your LIHTC to finance single-family renters, it's 15 years before you can get that person into ownership. And right now, it's a little bit unclear if CHFA has thought about operating in this way. In Colorado, it's usually more multifamily developments. And then there's a little bit of ambiguity. In Ohio, they've cleared it, but depending on where you look in the tax code, the affordability requirement is 15 years or 30 years. So that could potentially be a little bit sticky. The third program that we looked at is the One Mortgage Model, and this is out of Massachusetts. It's another mortgage lending program for low to moderate income residents. Also, they're able to provide loans with low interest rates, low down payments, and again, no cost for the private mortgage insurance. So altogether, that brings costs down for owners by hundreds of dollars a month. This program's been around for a long time. It used to operate under a different name, but it was started in 1990, and they have done over 21,000 loans. Another really cool thing about this is they're able to provide financing not only for single family homes, but also people moving into a duplex or a triplex property. And households that earn below 80% of the area median income are eligible for an additional subsidy for their down payment. The downside of this is it's only available to first-time home buyers, and they still have to have a pretty good credit score. It has to be at least 640. And the way that they're able to offer the lower interest rates and no private mortgage insurance is by having a fairly large public loan loss reserve to mitigate the risk. So that's another consideration with this type of program. And then the last thing that really stood out when we were doing our environmental scan is a program out of New York. It's a third-party company called Isuzu, and it's designed to help renters become able to use positive rental payments to improve their credit scores so that eventually they'll be able to buy a home down the road. So this company actually contracts with the landlords on the premise that if renters are earning or able to improve their credit for on-time rent payments, they're going to be more motivated to pay their rent on time. So right now, in the context of credit reporting, less than 1% of rental payment data goes to improving credit scores. And so there's a lot of potential and a lot of room for growth for people who are renting. And in the context of, our racialized housing environment, when you have a ownership rate for white families above 70% who are able to count, their mortgage payments to constantly improving their credit scores versus an ownership rate for Black families of about 48% that aren't able to count their on-time rental payments, you can see how this disparity gets wider and wider. The downside is if landlords do decide to pass through the cost of the credit reporting, it could contribute to higher rents. So there is a consideration there as well. And then for the homebuyer matchmaking model, I'll go ahead and let Jonathan explain this proposed idea for Denver.
Thanks, Mary. So this is just something that was, there may be other analogs of this in other places in the country, but this is essentially an idea that we have been working on with Lydia, and it is not fully fleshed out, but here are the bones of it. So there's a lot of homeowners who are trying to leave Westwood, but who would prefer to sell their home to a local resident rather than an investor if they had a choice. There are folks who've been longtime residents, and there's always their plan to leave eventually. There's their nest egg, their wealth building strategy to have this home, but they don't like the way the neighborhood is changing. So how can we pair community-minded sellers with prospective homeowners instead? A big part of displacement is involuntary, right? But it's not always completely involuntary. Sometimes people want to move anyway. There's some of that natural attrition, but how do we make sure that we fill that gap and don't allow that natural turnover to result in an unnatural, super fast shift to investors? So a pretty big percentage of the cost of any given home is taken up in transaction fees, the realtor fees, buyer side closing costs, seller side closing costs. Also, there are home buyer programs out there, but they're not always super well coordinated. So you'll have CHAFA's first-time homebuyer down payment assistance grant, which can be like 4% of the value. And then City of Denver, will, depending on the type of development, it can give subsidies of $25,000 a unit. It kind of depends, but that's roughly what they budget, and they have listed in their term sheets for what they're willing to spend to help subsidize a for-sale unit. And then you can maybe add another $10,000 in a variety of other, programs. So if you do that, in theory, the potential value of savings and incentives for a $300,000 home adds up to $91,000. and then the potential value of savings and incentives for a $400,000 home, it's $107,000. That is not quite enough, especially on the 400,000 side, not quite enough to make it affordable to even a median income earner in Westwood. It gets closer, but this is just an example of an idea that we've been trying to work with Lydia to sort of mature. If there are other ways to fill the remaining gap, the point is, how can you, assemble savings and resources and incentives together, cover that cost, get a low-income homeowner or renter into a household for less than it would cost to build it from scratch, right? So as long as we stay above that, then technically it's a good deal. So that's the sort of the reasoning there behind that nascent idea. Next, please. Okay, so implementation. Let's see. I think you were going to do this, Mary.
Oh, okay. So this is the piece I really wish Lydia were here to talk about, because she has the best perspective on this. But all of that data that we presented earlier, as well as the ideas, are only one half of the puzzle, and the other half is connecting with people on the ground. And so Lydia is working with community connectors from Westwood, and are able to reach out to people in a variety of languages. They support English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Arabic. And they're trained to help households navigate the housing landscape and other social programs, as well as to continue the feedback loop of connecting with residents of what their needs are. And so the community connectors have been leveraging the data in order to sort of reach out to people. Like we said at the top of the presentation, in the last 4 to 5 months or so, the focus and the capacity of the organization has really shifted to COVID-related needs and addressing an immediate response. But we're hoping once the acute phase of that crisis is over, that we can get back to the work of keeping the data updated and using it to really have direct targeted responses. And to facilitate that goal, as well as the COVID related need, we also helped put together a resource list for the community connectors to use that address general community services, home repair and home modification needs, home ownership assistance, as well as assistance for the coronavirus. Was there anything else you wanted to add on that, Jonathan?
No, that was great, Mary. Yeah, so I know we went, looks like maybe 5 minutes over what our goal was, which was to end at 10:45. But yeah, we can open up to questions. There was one quick question that I saw that went just straight to panelists. It was, if only 10% of the total housing market in Denver is given the status of affordable housing, how does that compare against a population who would qualify for that kind of housing? And is Denver planning to increase that percentage? So I wouldn't say that it's not like 10% was a goal that the city laid out. That's just what, if you add up all the LIHTC units and other units, and including home ownership, if you add that all together, you come up with about 10%. And the city is constantly trying to invest more money on the development side to incentivize, a faster rate of development, at least in theory, to combat that. Of course, about half of renters in Denver are housing cost burden. The short answer is that it's not nowhere near close enough to meet the need, and that's just renters. But the policy step, is, I get your question, but that's not really how the city's thinking about it, but it's a way that they could think about it. Makes sense.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I do want to also share, I'll put this into the chat for everybody, but just in case you weren't following the chat, Renee Stone just clarified that 3,900 households were mostly renters whose home were sold, but not by them. She thinks 70% are LIHTC buyers, creating change in households over 100,000 K AMI. So it's also increasing average income and lowering cost burden. Just want to make sure that everyone saw that clarification.
Thanks, Phil.
Anyone have any additional